We shouldn't pretend that Canada is a neutral actor in the story of democracy's erosion across the world. Canadian corporations, for example, have been parcel, central to the story of reactionary power, taking on southern poor countries for their efforts to regulate the environment, raise minimum wages, or take care of local populations. My name is David Adler. I'm the general coordinator of the Reactionary International, which is an organization dedicated to uniting, organizing, and mobilizing progressive forces across the world to defeat the far right and win a better planet. It's very common in discussions of democracy's decline to focus on the famous figures or the famous faces of the far right, the politician, the billionaire, the influencer, the strongman. And I think it's important to step away from that personalistic account of the rise of the far right and the menace they pose to our democracies. Take a more infrastructural view of what we might call a reactionary international. That's the parties and the politicians, but it's also the foundations and the think tanks, the financiers and the entrepreneurs, the tech CEOs and the platforms they manage. It's looking at the way in which this infrastructure at global level captures and corrodes our democratic systems at a local level. This approach can tell us a lot about why we're seeing such similar defects in our democratic systems in so many different parts of the world that are afflicted by the application of this reactionary architecture in our own local contexts. The Reactionary International is our name for this network of right-wing power that has, over the past years and decades, been growing in its capacity to coordinate across borders and in the application of its plans, policies, programs, and ideas in our domestic systems. So I'll give a few examples of how that works. One case is technology. The reactionary forces of the world have become very talented at using this technology to create new circuits of disinformation and manipulation and suppression and censorship, as well as develop new apps and technologies to surveil us. These are deeply pernicious ways in which the Reactionary International affects our democratic systems, and we as progressives have been slow to catch up with the consequences of that enhanced coordination. But it's not just technology. It's also in trade and in finance, for example, where we can see these consequences play out. Once upon a time, people were very outraged by the Panama Papers and the LuxLeaks, these things that reveal the scale and the severity of tax evasion and illicit finance across the world. I think it's time that we took that seriously, not just as a question of tax justice, but as a foundational question for our democracy, because it's that hidden illicit finance which goes on to fund political campaigns, climate denial, that leaks in and through our democratic systems in ways that serve to erode their foundations. I think democracy at Canada needs to be understood in both directions when we talk about the threats to democracy. First, there's the ways in which the Reactionary International conspires against Canadian democracy itself. And there's no doubt, whether it's looking at the question of finance or technology or foundations and think tanks, there's no doubt that this architecture plays a foundational role in pushing, for example, fossil fuel projects and legislation that are based on a denial of the climate crisis in which we live. But it's also critical to focus on Canada's role in the Reactionary International and how it plays out in other parts of the world. We shouldn't pretend that Canada is a neutral actor in the story of democracy's erosion across the world. Canadian corporations, for example, have been parcel, central to the story of reactionary power, taking on southern poor countries for their efforts to regulate the environment, raise minimum wages, or take care of local populations, weaponizing instruments such as the investor-state dispute settlement system to try to protect their profit margins at the cost of the well-being of communities on other sides of the planet. It's very common to say that we need to think globally and act locally. That was the adage that carried us through 3 decades of organizing, being conscious that we live in a globalized world, but acting locally to try to impact the distributive consequences of globalization. The Reactionary International teaches us to invert those terms, that it's time for us to look locally, look at the consequences for our communities, for our young children, for education, for housing and transport, looking at all the ways in which our democracy has been corroded at its core in recent years. But we have to act globally. We have to act in ways that can serve to dismantle that great architecture, That means acting globally to take on the international financial system, dominated as it is by the US dollar, and riven through with this Swiss cheese financial system that seeps out money from our democracies and into offshore havens, for example. Acting globally to rewrite the rules of trade so that people and communities are not impacted by a global race to the bottom, that they're not stripping out and undermining the well-being of our communities. So it's time for us to think about how all of the concerns we have here in Canada, the United States, and Europe, all around the world, are related critically to the story of this Reactionary International. And until we can identify those culprits and begin to take them on for the crimes they have committed, we're not going to be able to provide the most fundamental goods and public services that can inspire confidence and trust in our democratic systems here in Canada or anywhere else. Reactionary forces are galloping forward across the world, here in Canada, in Europe, in the Americas, everywhere. Our task, in the face of their increased coordination, in the face of their increased audacity to go after our democracies, the fundaments of our communities, is to build our own international, a progressive international that links together workers, parties, movements, unions all around the world to take on those reactionary forces, to kick them out of our public space, of our public discourse, of our public contracts. That's the only way we're going to live on a planet that we deserve. It's by building that international in a spirit of genuine solidarity that's more than a slogan.